My name is George Steele, and welcome to T6 Crafting Successful Advisor Training and Development Programs. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that Jennifer Joslin, Scott Byington, and Catherine Doss have done this presentation in the past, and some of the slides that are within this presentation, they actually created. Thank you. As we develop today's, what we're really trying to do is help you look at a framework for developing professional development programs and training. So the idea here is to help you to look at some of the questions you might need to ask in order to develop these type of programs, consider ways to model active learning and involvement. From your perspective, how do you help people through this process of active learning, but also how to craft these through a learning-centered lens. So it's active learning. So the focus is on what the participants learn as opposed to just what type of content you'll be presenting. And also ways of looking at how do you know when your program is being successful. So how do you end up by injecting into this processes of evaluation that you can use to help yourself consider and assess how well you are doing with your programs. So when we look at this, there's a tie between this session and session T17. And so in this one, we'll first start looking at the idea of who's your audience. What is it, a primary role advisor? Are you looking at from a peer advisor, student worker, faculty advisor, part-time advisor? What is your focus for this type of training? So it can be very broad, and all of you may be doing something a little bit different. Also, the idea is that there's some topics in here that are going to be also in like T17. So the ones in red, T6, what topics, where, and program evaluation will be predominantly addressed in this session. Whereas under the green, active learning, learning outcomes, and assessment methods, we'll be touching on both of these in both of these two sessions. And finally, resources and activities will be predominantly be addressed in T17. So when we look at this, and this is a nice graph here, I think, of the difference between training and professional development. The notion is that training is mostly short-term with concrete goals. It's centered more upon the work tasks that people have to perform. It's usually for people who have to do new things or when you introduce a new type of topic into your workforce. For example, if you had a new student information system, everyone would have to go through the training on that, even though they may have been working for 20 years. So this is a nice way of looking at this. Now, professional development is more along the lines of long-term type of activities, things that you can do and develop within a professional to have them look at the way they conduct their practice in a different and unique ways. This could be interjecting notions of new theories, new ways of approaching students. And the notion is that it's a little bit more personal over time. And it's a way of moving forward and taking a look at these two different types of ways of addressing the idea of how do we help professionals become better professionals. So when we look at this, the first thing we would like to try to do today is activity one is a worksheet that we have associated with this session. And the question is who is your audience? And so what we'd like you to do with this first session or first activity is to identify who's your audience, and then the idea of scope. What are you looking at? What are you considering? Are you looking at an initial training program for new advisors or introducing a new topic for everyone? Is this sort of a periodic professional development training program where you introduce something new and inject something new, let's say with your group, where you may be doing something such as having them read an article over lunch? Or is this an extended professional development retreat when you're really getting into some new types of approaches or some type of assessment that you want all advisors to be participating in? So what I'd like you to do is take a little bit of time, and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to let you end up by looking at the worksheet that I'm showing you right now. When we look at the questions that you've answered, and we'll be talking about these during our session at the end of this video, one or two things we may want to take into consideration of where and how this is going to occur. Are you thinking of presenting your professional development or training in something such as an existing structure, a convocation, a department meeting, or a retreat? Is that the idea that you have in the back of your mind? If so, that's great. Or are you going to have to create some type of new structure in order to do that? And that is something you may want to take into consideration. And one of those might be something, let's say, if you wanted to do something on training and in technology, you may need to have a special type of a retreat or a situation where you have everyone accessing the technology at the same time. It's important when we look at the how of professional development and training that you always bring in administrators in multiple points along the line. One is to help make it successful is having them introduce the training or the professional development, but it's also having them know beforehand what you're trying to do and getting their input in terms of the framework of what you're trying to achieve in terms of your training or professional development. The other thing is to think in tiers, phases, so you have a comprehensive program, but you can provide milestones along the way. And an example of that would be, I think that if we go with a blended environment using technology such as a learning management system or a e-portfolio, we can develop modules such as policies and procedures, working with subtypes of students or special types of students, or looking at the idea of addressing the topics of technology, or looking at other type of issues that might be how do you refer students to campus resources. And if you have these broken down in small bites and being able to celebrate them, it becomes a very helpful and provides people with the idea of, okay, this is good. And also when each of these are probably in terms of active learning, which we'll be talking about here shortly, the notion that if you use some case studies to make it real and ask them how they would apply this type of knowledge to working with particular types of students in the case study is an excellent way to go. Okay, in terms of delivery methods for programs, again, what you can do is if you're looking at some other ways outside of traditional type of approaches that you might have, is to look at maybe implementing seminars or workshops or a symposium and calling them these things something a little bit different by creating something new, forum, doing job shadowing. If you're using, again, the learning management system, what you can do is perhaps have people react to a case study, have them end up basically then posting the lines on a discussion board, and then using those responses on a discussion board as a group meeting where you end up by comparing and contrasting how you might work with the student. Panels are a really great way if you have people who are experts within the field or people whom you refer to on campus, let's say the counseling center or the career center, to come in and actually participate. Webinars, videos, online courses, there's a lot of things out there on YouTube that you may want to pull in and actually use. Tours. Everyone loves taking tours of campus. This is a great way of going forward. And of course, the campus experts make great people for panels. The other thing is you may want to really take into consideration here is what are you calling this? It matters not only to faculty, but also to, I think, all people involved. Seminar, lunch to learn, professional development. Sometimes people will look upon the term training as something very low level, and it's not, of course it isn't. But you got to be aware of the use of nouns here and what the impact might be. Forum and workshop are all important type of considerations that you need to be able to ask as some of these questions that we're reviewing right now that you want to be able to present to those who are helping you shape and develop your program. One of the ways, though, to looking at some of the topics is to rely upon, I think, maybe the best source right now for us to do is NACADA core competencies. And the NACADA core competencies are set up in terms of conceptual, informational, and relational. And underneath of these, there are a number of types of ways in which we can look at the skills and the type of knowledge that people need for moving forward. Now, the first one I pulled up is a conceptual one. And as you can see, there is a listing of different types of categories of items that can help you begin to organize your training or your professional development, such as a history and role of academic advising in higher ed, core values, theory relevant to academic advising. You know, this could be the Holland Code, this could be Myers-Briggs type indicator, it could be any number of type of theories that are relevant, developmental theory, advising approaches, again, developmental approaches, maybe appreciative advising. Expected outcomes of academic advising. What do you expect from academic advising? You can compare and contrast your institution with other institutions, even in other countries, because we are a global organization. And how to bring about equitable and inclusive types of environments and move forward in that regard. Under informational, this one is, again, more focused on some of the institutional type of areas of history, mission, values, and culture. Obviously, what you want to be able to do is help advisors realize there may be differences between public-private, community college, four-year, private or public, and so on, and help people understand that each institution is unique and has its mission, and that that's part of what it means to be a professional within that. Of course, degree programs, knowing curricular requirements, policies and procedures, legal guidelines, FERPA, for example, institutional policies such as rules and regulations for plagiarism. These are all important things, and certainly the notion of looking at student characteristics and special populations of students. What is it a little bit different from maybe undecided students versus maybe working with adult students, or when you have an adult undecided student? Then the resources that you have both in the community and on campus can help, and certainly how to use the technology, because of course after COVID we all know that it's a technology driven type of field. And of course, the last one of the core competencies is the idea of relational. And again, the idea of conceptually, where we can develop some modules here, is how do you build rapport in advising relationships? How can you communicate in a respectful manner? And again, this might be looking at both verbal and nonverbal type of ways of working with students. How do you plan and conduct advising sessions? You know, there are several different models out there for how to do an advising session, particularly how do you model it for developing critical thinking, promoting students' understanding of the logic and the purpose of the curriculum. Again, is that critical thinking approach and facilitating that. And finally, at least two, is engaging in ongoing assessment and development of advising practice. How can you end up by designing programs that actually help students and in terms of getting the feedback from them in terms of what they're learning and using that in the aggregate to see how your overall program is being successful, or where it may need some challenges and for improvement later on to move forward. So one idea of looking at this is by using a very important model called backward by design. And what's nice about backward by design is that this is a curricular and instructional approach that is used really at most institutions on their teaching and learning centers. And it's very simple. They want you to define your learning goals first. So when we talk about advising as an intentional activity, learning goals, right? So we have learning goals, and then the idea is to decide upon an assessment. And what is your evidence for learning? You know, so the notion here is, if we say we're helping people learn, not only students, when we use this with students, but also with professionals for training and professional development, what do you expect the learning outcomes to be? What is the evidence of learning? And then you design your activities and your methods. And a lot of this will be in T17, the last step, but we'll be talking about it a little bit here. But as you look at this, and again, I don't think any model per se should be followed in a linear type of approach. But what I would say is this, is that all these pieces have to hang together. And you may have a great activity, but if you can't decide upon the evidence for what the learning would be, why are you doing it? Likewise, if you may have a great activity here for learning outcomes, and you may have an activity for it, but you're not assessing the evidence, why not? So there has to be a balance here between all of these. Again, Reynolds in 2010 talked about the importance of the learning-centered lens approach to training and development, and the idea of clear and positive goals, and getting people involved in activities that they end up by having to process the information, process the content, and apply it, consider what does it mean to them. And this is the proper way of developing, I think, the motivation that is necessary to get people involved, because they can begin to see how it's important to their practice. And the idea, again, is high expectation, encourage high achievement. You know, we want you to be able to do this. We aren't going to let you slink off and say, this is unimportant. No, this is what's required. And it remains and requires a constant feedback loop. And one way, of course, of looking at this is by applying it to the NACADA concept of academic advising. And so basically, if we do this with students, this is another way of looking at it with training and professional development. We have learning outcomes for intentionality. We have a pedagogy of critical thinking, and the combination of the pedagogy of critical thinking with methods and activities combines into a curricular, and that curricular series of topics is also related to the NACADA core competencies. So what we'd like to do with your activity 2, what would be an important training professional development topic for your team? Looking at the NACADA core competency. How is this topic related to the NACADA core competencies? And why is this important? So what we'd like you to do right now is take a few moments and take a look at section 2, your activity 2, and answer that. Welcome back. we will be talking about these and how you ended up by responding to activity 2 in our session after this video. But again, thank you for participating in this, and I'm looking forward to what the conversation will entail for us all. Let's move on and talk about evaluation of programs. And again, the notion here of defining and evaluating the program, if we go back to the notion of backward by design, you need to define your outcomes first and what you want advisors to learn in order to see if you're successful. And in the same way that they end up with backward by design is, what is the evidence of learning? Well, did people end up by achieving those type of learning outcomes that you wanted to by having examples of the evidence present? So looking at this and seeing what's going on here, the other important point I think under that first large bullet point is you should also be comparing what you think of your advisor program is compared to what you expect for student outcomes, because there should be overlap there. If you expect something from student learning outcomes, how are the advisors helping students achieve those outcomes? So you really have to look at both elements of your program in that regard. Evaluation methods, though, let's look at the second point, can be quite extensive. Outcome-based surveys, reflection papers from the participants in your professional development or training program, constant use of case studies and getting feedback, having group conversations, one-on-one demonstrations of knowledge by talking, maybe having the supervisor sit down and have that conversation with a member of the advising staff, or having people end up by using an e-portfolio and actually having folks talk about how they've successfully ended up by being engaged in different types of training and professional development program, video training, so on. But I think the other area here is also, if you are using a blended approach with a learning management system or an e-portfolio, all your content should be in that. I don't care if you're doing synchronous or asynchronous. I don't care if you're doing a face-to-face workshop or other. If the content is in the learning management system and you have your evaluation built into that system, you're always going to have that data available, and that's critical. Also, the notion is within even the when you're doing this, if you're doing a case study and interpretation and so on, you can develop rubrics, as we all know, within that learning management system to evaluate how successful you think someone is in terms of addressing how to apply a theory to a case study, how to apply policies and procedures to a case study. And these are things that if we do this up front, it makes the idea of the evaluation process much easier. Okay. And again, evaluation of program, Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training is a nice model to use. The first level, of course, is feedback from participants on the value of the program. You can have the greatest program in the world, but if people don't think they're getting anything out of it, that should be a warning sign, obviously. The idea of evaluation of knowledge gains by the participants. And again, if it's a learning management system, it's blended, you're going to have a pretty good idea about the evidence of learning. Okay, evaluate the application of knowledge and behavioral changes. Again, this is one of the things that might be a little bit more of a supervisory type of issue, but if you spend a lot of time on looking at developmental type of approaches and developmental theories, and you see folks on the team not engaging in using these, where is the disconnect? And that should be a question that is raised. Level 4 is define impact on the institution, such as through key performance indicators, enrollment, persistence, and completion. And that's very good, but it's also the one we go back to the earlier point about comparing these to the expected student outcomes. The notion is that the training program has to align with what you expect from the student outcomes and what is your student advising curriculum outcomes. So the nice thing about this is that as we go through this is we're going to take a look at this next worksheet. So what we'd like you to do here on activity 3 is to refer again to the worksheet. And in the worksheet, we have a series of columns. And what we'd like you to do is, how do you know advisors have learned? What evaluation methods will you use? Reflection paper, surveys. And so basically, as we go through this graph, what we want you to do is take just one learning goal that you have and try to plot out and fill out this worksheet so that you can begin to see how this might develop with just one, so we can take this as an example of applying it to the other ones that you'll be developing when you address your training and your professional development programs. Okay, great. It'll be interesting to have this conversation, and when we talk through this with you for activity 3 about how you ended up by addressing just one learning outcome, addressing all of these type of questions. So as we go through this, and some final thoughts I'd like to share with you before we get to this conversation piece. Uh, First, when you're just looking at training professional development programs, the notion is you have to continually ask advisors what they need. Uh, a number of topics may come up that are outside the NACADA core competencies. So it's really critical to pay attention to see how you can end up by including these type of concerns into your training and professional development. The other notion is are there other professional organizations with content that your institution can partner with that can provide you with other ways of addressing concerns that might arise, such as the career advising areas or adult organizations, adult student organizations to help you look at these type of issues. Another question is, particularly at some institutions, is there's a stipend or no stipend, and some of these are sometimes tied up into union contracts. So you need to take this into consideration, or if not a union shop, then is it something that you can still do in order to get people to participate? You need to structure a program to go beyond informational competency. And again, the cause core competencies by looking at the conceptual and the relational are great ways of doing this. The informational is important. A lot of times this might be the first step in your training, but going beyond that is critical. Don't be afraid to utilize experts on your field or your campus or exceptional advisors who serve as leaders. Great panel discussions. And a good way too of having them challenge. Possibility here is, let's say you have everyone do a case study, you have them respond to it, and you throw it to the panel on how they would do the case study. How are they similar, how it's different. So the nice thing you can talk about there. Again, we talked about structure of the programs and tiers and milestones. And again, having reward structures built into this, celebration points where you can say, okay, great, let's move on, and basically reward the group for their participation and their involvement. And also this notion here can be looking at the notion of, are some of the elements that you're trying to develop in your training program, are they also part of perhaps job descriptions? What are the expectations? Particularly you have a tier advisor session where you have tier advisor 1, 2, and 3. How does this align with your training program? You need to take this into consideration. Also include discussions around research briefs or theories, and a great way is to discuss an important article that may have occurred in the NACADA advising today, or the NACADA journal, and bringing that and having a conversation about it and bringing that forward. Asking people what the implications are for their advising practice, what is it for the program. Utilize the online courses and structure, and I've talked about blended, and I would need a very strong evidence to suggest from anyone as why you would not be using a blended approach, bottom line. Be open to feedback about participants' experiences within the professional development. Not all professional development is going to be treated equally or interpreted the same way, so it's nice to get that type of feedback and why people feel differently about the activity that they've been involved in. Again, structure online work, again, a blended environment, individual assignments, all these things could be done. The beauty of, again, the learning management system in a blended approach, if you have some individuals who might have some difficulty interpreting, let's say, a theory or understanding it, they can always go back and redo it because it's always there. And that's a way of helping people develop and grow and learn what you believe is important and critical for them to be engaged in. Finally, recognize completion and think of a designation of advisor. So again, this ties really back into the idea to some extent of having along the way recognitions built in or successes. And if people end up by passing through the training program to become advisor 1, advisor 2, to become a master advisor, if they end up by achieving a certain level of professional development beyond a certain point, above and beyond what is expected. So these are all things that we may want to take into consideration. Okay, great. Now let's take a look at your worksheets and use that as a basis of our conversation that we'll use for the rest of the session and helping you develop your advisor training or professional development program using some of the framework type of questions that we've talked about here in the last 20 minutes or so. Thank you.